morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, and all the good. So my name is Dr. Melissa Malambo, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pretoria, specifically in the Department of Political Science. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Emmanuel Nuesiri. He'll be providing us with a presentation on watching Rome burn, the effects of international governance bodies and extra environmental grouping. Dr. Nuesiri is a chair for the IUCN Commission on Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy, Natural Resource Governance Framework Working Group. His research interests center around community conservation, environmental safeguards, adaptation governance, and more recently, household circular economy practices. He has served as a research person for several UN agencies, including the FAO, the UNDP, and the UN Economic Commission for Africa. He's also consulted on a number of organizations like Friends of the Earth, WWF, and FFI. On behalf of my university and all our partners who are part of the Global Classroom, I'd like to thank Dr. Nuesiri for being willing to speak to us, and I'm sure that his insights will spark some interesting conversations and discussions, not only in today's class, but also beyond this lecture. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr.
Nuesiri. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to Melissa and Prudence for the invitation to give this talk. Let me share my screen and go directly to my presentation, and I'll take questions from you after that. I understand that I have an hour, so I'll try to give my presentation about 30 minutes, a bit less, a bit more, and then we can take questions from there. So here we go. So the seminar, of course, is it's about international governance bodies and extra environmental groupings, but I have titled my own presentation, Global Drivers of Environmental Governance Policy. As we go through this, it would answer to the theme that we have for today and hopefully answer to your questions and curiosities that you might have. As you've already been told, I'm the chair of the IUCN Commission on Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy, Natural Resource Governance Framework Working Group. So my presentation plan, I'm going to use Africa as a case in point to talk about evolution of natural resource policies, so evolution of environmental policies. I use Africa as a case in point, obviously, because this is the continent I know best. I'm originally from Cameroon, even though right now I live in the United States, and I'm speaking to you from a little city called Champaign in Illinois. So I'm using Africa as a stepping stone into this, but you would recognize the processes that Africa has gone through, whether in South America or in Asia and in Europe to an extent. You would see all this, and then you would see these drivers, and then I would speak a little bit on some of the global conventions that are out there. So for Africa, right, we went through the pre-colonial era where the environment, we managed our environment in line with our traditions and customs. Now, again, like I said, this is the same everywhere, whether it's Asia, South America, Europe, it's same everywhere. 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or you go back 2,000 years or 3,000 years, there were these I'll call them principles and practices to the way we manage our environment that were more localized. Because obviously back then, we hadn't built the kind of global institutional structures that we have today, where you can have a global mandate that then everyone tries to follow. So we had these principles and practices that were more, in line with where people live, more site-specific, in different places that people live. Today, we still talk about those, and there's a recognition that there is something there in environmental governance today when we talk about ITK, indigenous traditions and knowledge. So this was what it was everywhere. 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, there were these local practices that were tied to, that were place specific and that were derived from people having real knowledge of their own landscape, their own weather patterns, and their own food needs and all of that. Then for Africa and other parts of the world, there was then the colonial era. The colonial era started from explorers in Europe going out there to look for resources. That's how it started. Resources, trade, and slaves. Resources, trade, and slaves. And when the world passed through that phase where they were like, we don't want slavery anymore, then those that were involved in the slave trade now said, if we can't have slaves to come over here and work our plantations, we're going to go over there and create those plantations and make the people work them. So that gave birth to the colonial era. That was sort of part of the motivations and incentives for colonization. It was, hey, we can't get slaves from these parts of the world to come to the islands in the Caribbean and other places to work our plantations. We're going to take the plantations out there, the rubber plantations, the cocoa, the coffee, and all that, and we're going to get people in these places to work them. So colonization with its centralized control, centralized in the sense that, so you had countries in Britain that had colonies in different parts of the world, and they had these strategies that they deployed in different parts of the world. So there was a form to British colonialism, there was a form to French colonialism, there was a form to Portuguese colonialism or German colonialism that took their impetus from the colonial state that was in charge of all of this. So you began to see this sort of centralized colonial control principles and policies and practices on the way the environment was exploited, the way the environment was used, and ultimately the way the environment was managed. So the colonial control spread to North America, South America, Africa, Asia, and all of that. The way the environment was managed, we saw things like the idea of national parks. National parks, the idea came up in the United States, and then it went to Europe. They loved the idea because it went with ideas of the King's Forest and all of that. And they're like, oh, wow, this is really great. We can export this to the colonies. And the first national parks in colonial states often were in the colonial era. So there was that centralized colonial control. There was limited privatized enterprise, and of course, there were customary concessions. So the traditional customary ways of doing things were not totally abrogated. They were limited, and you had to get special permits in some places to continue doing the cultural practices that your ancestors did. Then came the independence era. We went towards centralized control. In the independence era, centralized state control everywhere, limited private enterprise. You still had customary concessions. A lot of the independent states in Africa and elsewhere, they didn't totally do away with the traditional structures, the customary structures. They contained them and they limited them even more than the colonial state did. So we still see this till date, where in some countries you have the House of Chiefs. In some countries in the Northern Hemisphere, in the United States or in Canada, you have these special areas for native peoples and all that. So there's still that, customary concessions going on. Of course, present day, we are in a situation in the present day where there is the weakened state, where we've moved from government to governance, as that paper that I put there shows. We've moved from government be the it all, it knows it all, it does it all, to, hey, the state should be managed through decentralized governance, where government and business and private actors, the tripartite state, weakened state control in many places. Not everywhere, but in many places. Definitely in places like China and Russia, we don't have weakened state control. We still have the strong centralized state. But the general tendency, spread by the World Bank, the IMF, the UN, and all that, is for governance, where the state is just one actor amongst many actors. And this is coming to the environmental domains, where we've got the powerful NGOs. Some of these NGOs have budgets that are bigger than states. And then we have, the strengthened enterprise, civil society, customer authority is being brought in with concern for indigenous people, indigenous rights, and all of that. And the present day, we've gone through this whole process of downsizing, deregulation, democratization, decentralization, deconcentration in the present day. So that has led to what you see in a place like Congo-Kinshasa today. This is a coltan mine where these are ordinary people that are doing some form of artisanal type of mining, but what they produce is being bought by private actors. And these private actors often have their private armies right there in the state. And even when the state, in a place like the Congo, the state has tried to assert its power, some of these private actors are powerful enough to fight back against the state. They have weapons and funding to fight back against the state. So these private actors are sort of like a state within a state. This is where we are today. And this has implications for environmental policy and environmental, and how we manage our environment everywhere in the world. This is Congo, but this could as well be someplace in South America or someplace in Asia, because of where we are today. But how did we get here? How did we get here? We got here because of economic interest. We got here because of political transformations that have taken place in the last 500 years. And ultimately, the global architecture that we have put in place, environmental architecture that we have put in place, has been responding to economic drivers and political drivers, but also to the ecological crisis that we ultimately produced because of our economic interest and the politics behind those economic interests. So economic interest, when we talk about economic interest, you've got to go back to industrialization. Industrialization, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Now, this does not imply that there was no economy before industrialization. There was economy before industrialization. So if you go back to the Egyptian Empire or the Babylonian Empire or the Greece Empire or the Roman times or the great Chinese civilizations and all that, there was economy and economic interest before industrialization. What industrialization simply did was that it gave us machines and tools to be able to do things that you would need a lot of human power to do within a short space of time. So we went from horse-drawn carriages to mechanized cars. So one mechanized car could be the equivalent of 60 horsepower. One car could have an engine that is the equivalent of 200 horsepower. And those engines, of course, we use them, we put them in earth movers, we put them in rockets and all that. So we can do much more. In the farms also, we can do much more. Industrial production. Industrialization in Europe led to urbanization. People left their villages and the rural environments, and they then started to flock to the initial big cities, big industrial cities. That's how people flocked to London, or people flocked to Paris and all of that. People left their hamlets and all that, and they flocked to these big cities, industries and all that, and led to urbanization everywhere. And that idea to urbanization led to people being able to move on steamships and all that to the new world, the United States and all of that, and to being able to exploit resources afar off and transport these resources to their home countries. Industrialization led to these kinds of social and ecological changes around the world. We were able to do more. And of course, that being able to do more also led to what is known as the transatlantic slave trade. You can't divorce industrialization from that. There was slave trade before the transatlantic slave trade, but the nature of the transatlantic slave trade, it was mass production, so to speak. You could transport these great numbers of people to these places and house them and feed them and make them do work. Industrialization sort of helped with that. And when the slave trade was forced to come to an end, industrial capacity enabled colonialization. So industrialization changed the world completely. And then later on, there was then this big shift, the economic paradigm shift. Now, the economic paradigm shift was something that happened after the Second World War. Before the Second World War, there was a general consensus, accepted consensus, that government is responsible for the state, for the economy. We listened to government and everybody took their prompts from government. Business took its prompts from government. Society took its prompts from government. We looked to government. But something happened after the Second World War. There was this guy, Friedrich Hayek. Friedrich Hayek, some of you may never have heard of Friedrich Hayek, and some of you may never have heard of The Road to Serfdom. But Friedrich Hayek wrote this work after the Second World War, The Road to Serfdom. And in it, Friedrich Hayek argued that government should not, I'm really summarizing this, Friedrich Hayek argued that government should not be in charge of anything. That when you put government in charge of things, you become slaves to government. You become a serf. Government becomes the master and you become the slave. And Hayek argued that we don't want to do that. The more powerful government becomes, the more we become the slave of government. That we should take back our freedoms. We should take back our liberty from government. Republicanism that you know today in the United States, the Republican Party, they are disciples of Hayek. But after the Second World War, the initial economist who made a name was Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, because Keynes was, hey, government needs to really help the people. So there was the Marshall Plan and all that, government pumping money into the economy. But Hayek was there. He had written his work and he was a contemporary of Keynes. But something began to happen in the 60s and 70s. Organized labor, workers, had become very powerful. The labor unions, workers had become very, very powerful, and government was listening to workers. But at some point, the industrialists and capitalists began to fight back against the right of workers. And the work of people like Friedrich Hayek became the intellectual fulcrum for that. That work was then given a rocket boost when people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher came into power. in the 80s, they believed in Hayek's logic. Margaret Thatcher said stuff like, there's no such thing as community. It's every person for themselves. And they began pushing the ideas of privatization. In the United States, in the United Kingdom, and from there, it went to the World Bank and the IMF. Began pushing the ideas of privatization. The state should step back and private enterprise should have free hand. So the political system, which had seen government to be the all-in-all, took this knock from Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. They were in the state, but they hollowed out the state, they weakened the state. So the Westphalian state model that had been followed for over 500 years, that put government at the center of everything, the Westphalian model collapsed in the time of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. The post-World War II consensus that the state should lead to development collapsed. The Cold War that was also state-centric, you know, the United States and its allies, Russia and its allies, it also collapsed during this period. And the Berlin Wall fell and all of this. So from the 80s to the 90s, we got this thing where economic interest became the primary motivator for everything, even for the existence of the state. The state should serve economic interest. The state should create regulations that favor economic interest. The developmental state, the state for people's interest, collapsed and it became the economic state, the state for private interest. Of course, all these things that we were doing led to overexploitation of the world's resources, led to externalities where there was nothing like producer responsibility schemes, where a producer is responsible for collecting the waste that their product has caused and for becoming more efficient. There was nothing like that. So producers will produce, send into the market, we will consume and dump. Dump into the atmosphere, dump into the seas, dump onto the land, clear fell forest, and all of this, and the world will face an ecological crisis. Obviously, at that time, there were people like Francis Fukuyama in the 80s that celebrated the end of history and the last man when the Cold War fell, when the Soviet Union collapsed. People like him said, hey, capitalism has won. Capitalism is now the greatest idea ever. Capitalism and the ideas of liberty, as they were called, which encapsulated ideas from people like Friedrich Hayek. They came up with books like this. Everybody celebrated Francis Fukuyama back then. Awesome. We've won. Private enterprise has won. This is where the whole world should be going. At the same time, we were concerned about the environment, and governments of the world, the peoples of the world, NGOs of the world, including IUCN, they were talking and talking and talking, and finally the world came together and put together what was called the World Commission on Environment and Development, that was headed by Gro Harlem Brundtland. She was the former Prime Minister of Norway, and they came up with Our Common Future in 1987. They were the ones that actually coined for global use the word sustainable development. Development that meets our needs today without compromising the needs of future generations. They were the ones that came up with it. When they came up with this and presented it to the world, this then led to the Rio Summit in 1992 in Brazil. All the world came together. The Rio Summit followed the 1972 World Environment Summit in Sweden. And at this point, there was recognition that we're damaging the earth and we need to do something, and we need to do something urgently. So while the private sector was celebrating that capitalism had won, the environmental movements of the world scored this big victory, because it was the environmental movements of the world, people from different countries, that really, really pushed, you know, people who published books, Silent Spring in the United States by Carson, and all that. Chico Mendes, who died in South America for protesting about what was happening to Robert Tapas and all that. But the environmental movement scored this big victory of, we need to come together and do something. Respond. We cannot just leave things to the market, because the market is just out for profit. And even though capitalism talks about the hidden hand and talks about market mechanisms being fair enough and all that, but we know that there are things like crony capitalism. So capitalism is not always fair. It can be manipulated to serve the interests of a few. The market is supposed to be fair to all, but the market has eyes. So UNCED happened in 92. And as a result of UNCED, we came up with a number of conventions as a result of UNCED. Let me go back. So number 3 there, you would see ecological crisis, you will see UNCED 92, Rio Conference, and you will see the UNCBD, the UNFCCC, the climate change thing. So there's the Convention on Biological Diversity, Convention on Climate Change, Convention on Desertification. Later on, of course, we had the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, 2030. Later on, we had the Paris Climate Agreement. Later on, or today, we have the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. But the key core global conventions are the CBD, UNCCC, UNCCD, and they then set the stage for the world working together with global mandates that governments have to meet. A lot of countries around the world, my country, Cameroon, definitely, Nigeria, South Africa, this was a lot of countries around the world had environment ministries. If you look to your own countries where you come from, you might discover that this was a period when your country also created an environment ministry, sometime between 1990 to 1995. A lot of environment ministries were created around that period because of this report, Our Common Future, and because of Rio. Lots of countries created environment ministries, lots of countries created environmental policies and decrees and all of this. So the first one is the Convention on Biological Diversity. The Secretariat sits in Canada and signed by 150 governments, conceived as a practical tool for translating principles of Agenda 21 into reality. So the first document Rio 92 produced is called Agenda 21. You can find it online. That talks about how we all have a stake in what happens to the world. Think globally, but act locally. Agenda 21. So Agenda 21, then we had all this convention. So this is the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's about, the convention recognizes that biological diversity it's more than plants, animals, microorganisms, ecosystems. It's also about people, food security, medicines, and all that. Following that, you also have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Let me go back. So the Convention on Biological Diversity, they have all these agreements that people signed to under these conventions. The first agreement that the world really signed to was called the Aichi Targets. The Aichi Targets, they're like the Sustainable Development Goals. They said, we will maintain this amount of biodiversity by this year, the Aichi targets. So all this, so you had the Aichi targets for CBD, you had the Kyoto Protocol for the UNCCC. All of these were built in the 90s, but they had a time span. So by the 2000s, these all had to be revised and reviewed. So the Aichi targets have been revised and reviewed, and now we have something called the Global Biodiversity Framework that was approved in 2021. The Global Biodiversity Framework is like the Paris Climate Change Agreement approved in 2015. It provides targets that the world has agreed to meet with regard to biodiversity, just like the Climate Change Agreement provides targets that the world has agreed to meet. So you have the United States Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Paris Agreement goals save and increase forest area to capture greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, hold average increase in global temperature to 2 degrees centigrade, make finance consistent and aligned with agreement goals, limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, increase ability to adapt to climate change. In a big picture, this is what is in the Paris Agreement goals. Every country is then supposed to produce what are called their program of work for their nationally determined contributions. So the way the agreement works is that it's not command and control. It's not by force. Every country voluntarily says, this is what we are going to do to meet these targets. They put that in their nationally determined contributions. Every country does that. It's voluntary. So the Paris Agreement at the end of the day is a weak agreement because it's voluntary. Maybe the world can never do better other than a weak agreement because of all the politics involved in coming to this agreement. I was in Paris in 2015 and I was in Dubai for the last COP. Thousands of people. It's difficult. So you have the Paris Agreement. You've got the United Nations Convention to combat desertification, 195 parties, 196 country parties, and the EU Convention is based on principles of participation, partnership, and decentralization. Multilateral commitment to mitigate impact of land degradation, protect our land, so we can provide food, water, shelter, and economic opportunity to all. These are the big global agreements. There are many others, but these are the big ones. Of course, you have the SDGs, the interconnected SDGs built on 3 foundations: economy, society, and biosphere. So you have SDG 6, water; 13, climate; 14, life on water; 15, life on land. Then you have society, end poverty, education, and all of this. Then you have economy, sustainable consumption, and all the rest. This is called the SDG layer cake or the SDG cake. We've also got the SDG guiding policies around the world. Then, of course, we have many others, agreements and conventions. There's a convention or an agreement behind what the FAO does for food around the world. You've got CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. We don't want people hunting elephants for their talks or rhinos and all of that. You have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which comes into play for environment because it's part of recognizing cultural knowledge, indigenous knowledge. You have the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, UNCLOS. It says a lot about how we can exploit the sea, deep sea mining and fishing and all of that. You've got the United Nations Agreement on Water. There are many more other than these, but big picture, these are the sort of global regulations you find out there that influences what governments around the world do. Because governments sign to be parties to these different conventions. All these conventions, all these agreements, they have targets, just like the Sustainable Development Targets. And every year, these conventions, they hold various scientific meetings and various meetings where governments report back on how they are meeting these targets. So irrespective of the country you come from, you will have something like the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, where your governments will say, these are our targets with respect to biodiversity. Irrespective of the countries you come from, you'll have the NDC, National Determined Contribution to Climate Change for the Paris Agreement, where your government says, this is how we hope to meet Paris Climate Change Agreement. If your country is part of the FAO, I think the Secretary General of the FAO right now is from China, but governments will have agreements on how they're going to meet food production, food distribution, food security in their countries, and international cooperation to meet these targets. All these conventions have something to say about international cooperation. For the SDG, is SDG 17 on international cooperation. So I have given you all just a big picture, and through this big picture, I hope you will have questions that can then help to further elaborate. Thank you. Thank you very much. So let me just correct something. So the Westphalian state was a developmental state. So during the Reagan and Thatcher era, states moved away from the developmental model to what we know today as the decentralized governance model. In the developmental model, the state was the parent, the father, or the mom of all. And today, states have moved from that to the decentralized governance model, where the state is one amongst, a number of actors who work to provide goods and services in the state. Now, these actors are supposed to be on equal footing in the sense that the state, private sector, civil society are all supposed to be on equal footing in theory. But in practice, what has tended to happen is that the private sector has actually swallowed everyone because the private sector has got a lot of money. And the private sector is able to use their money to influence the political constitution of the states in terms of the decision makers, the executive branch of the state, even the legislatures or the judiciary in some countries. So the current presidential election in America is going to cost more than $3 billion. Joe Biden does not have $3 billion. What I'm even saying, it could be more than that. Joe Biden does not have that money. Donald Trump, even if Donald Trump has that money, he's not going to pump all his billions of dollars into his campaign. So step in the corporate sector. The corporate sector steps in, funds this campaign, gets their ideas in there, and the state tends to respond first to the interests of the corporate sector. So even when they were doing the onset in 1992, the corporate sector came together to create what is called the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD. And WBCSD was very powerfully represented at Rio 92, alongside, of course, civil sector, thousands and thousands of NGOs. WCSD was highly represented, and the lead person at Rio 92, Maurice Strong from the UN side of things. Maurice Strong was a very good friend to Schmeideiner, who was the lead person from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So the WBCSD had an ear right in there. So the corporate sector, the market sector has become the most powerful. In states like Nigeria today, the corporate sector controls the presidency, the legislature, the judiciary, because they got the money. And even their big candidate there in Nigeria today, Peter Obi, from the Obedient Movement in Nigeria, who has this huge following in Nigeria. Everybody believes in Peter Obi. Peter Obi is a billionaire. He's from the corporate sector, a billionaire banker. South Africa, the current president of South Africa, what's his name again? Somebody remind me. The current president of South Africa.
Cyril Ramaphosa.
Cyril Ramaphosa, thank you. You all know he's from the corporate sector, right? From ANC to the corporate sector, from the corporate sector to the presidency. Does that mean that we all lay down and die at the altar of the corporate sector? Of course not. There's a lot of pushback from civil society, from indigenous peoples all over the world, from women's movements all over the world, from youth movements all over the world. There's a lot of pushback, you see. But something I want you all to know as young people is this. The tensions amongst these different partners in the state, the government sector, civil society, and all that will never go away. It's a never-ending tension. It will always be there. Because humans being what we are, we always push back against things that we think do not serve the best of human interest. It's just who we are. You know, of course, there are states who continue to be powerful states like China and Russia, and who continue to show that the powerful state can work. But the overwhelming trend, even within these powerful states, you can see, if great question, because the way states, the international state system works is that the international state system works by sanctions. So if the international system, international governance system thinks that you are not a good player, the international system will find a way to sanction you if they think that you are not a good player. Of course, there are voices that, some voices are stronger than others in the international system. You know, so you've got the UN Security Council where the USA, China, Russia, I think France and the UK, they can veto what others do. So, but generally, the international system tends to sanction. But states have ways in which they go around sanctions. And Iran, for instance, has been under different kinds of sanctions for quite a while. But states have friends, just like you and I have friends. Just like even when we are in a home and there are 6 children or 7 children, and daddy says or mommy says, go to your room, you're grounded. Your brother or sister will find a way to still come to you and say, hey, what's going on? Do you need a candy bar? So even in the international state system, states sanction one another, but friends in the system come, hey, do you need a candy bar? I can help you get a candy bar. Or people build relationships. So there are people who are in the state system who are friends. They are not just president of South Africa or president of Ghana. Some of them are friends. So even when Ghana says, I sanction South Africa, the president of Ghana and South Africa might be friends, and that friendship might mean that the president of Ghana might be willing to go through the back door to help the president of South Africa. So there are sanctions. This is the way states use to sanction one another if they think you're a bad faith player. So when we sign these agreements, even though they are voluntary, if we think that one particular state is not doing its fair share, other states will make a ruckus out of it when we come together at the COPs, or even NGOs. There are NGOs that are watchdogs. And these watchdogs will make a big deal of it. These are called horizontal accountability mechanisms. NGOs that are watchdogs. They can shout. They can't directly sanction a state, but they can show that this state is a bad faith player, or this company is a bad faith player. Boycott them. Boycott this firm. Or this state is a bad faith player, and they can make a lot of noise. They can name and shame, you know, as a bad faith player. Horizontal accountability mechanisms are out there. Sometimes it can be, it can have bite sometimes. Like when the world started talking that we must recognize gender issues, the World Bank took this up and said, hey, any nation submitting a project to the World Bank, if you don't have a gender component, the World Bank will not fund it. So it became a conditionality. So sometimes the international structures make some of these things conditionality. The donor world makes some of these things a conditionality. Presently, if your project, any kind of project you do, if it does not show an indigenous people plan, you don't get funding. Whether from the World Bank, the American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, yep, it becomes a conditionality. So sometimes some of these things have real teeth to it, you know, but states do still find a way to wriggle their way out of some of these things, especially the more stronger state. The more stronger a state is, the more they're able to wiggle themselves out of conditionalities, out of sanctions. It still bites, but they can wiggle themselves out of it. And it's because at the international level, there is what is called the principle of sovereignty. And at the United Nations, they respect what is called the principle of sovereignty. So for instance, because as a state, I'm doing ABC, I could be Taiwan, I could be, I don't know, Azerbaijan, I could be Kosovo, right? I could be any state, right? It does not imply that the United States can just come in and begin to do whatever they like to me because they think I'm a bad faith player. Or Russia can just step in and say, hey, because they think I'm a bad faith player. Or China can just step in and say, hey, because they think I'm a bad faith player. China and Taiwan, they're there. There's a deterrent. There's a deterrent because of the principle of sovereignty. We all scream about Ukraine and Russia because there's a principle of sovereignty. So states have the principle of sovereignty, which means that, you know, the way you get states to cooperate, yeah, you can push and nudge and threaten force, but the way you get states to work together is to seek cooperation and collaboration. And in most cases, the carrot, the carrot is what moves states in that direction more than the stick, you know. And of course, private interest sees to it sometimes that they don't allow you to use too much of a stick sometimes, because private interest comes into play to say, hey, we have a mine there. So US government, even if you want to go in there, could you please think about it? So yeah, there's a get out of the way, get out of jail card, but there's principle of sovereignty that you can't just smash just like that. You say I talked about the Aichi targets, as you know, and of course the SDG targets and all that, and how successful are these targets? Think about targets like at the start of the new year, and you make a resolution, right? These are my resolutions at the start of the new year. So how many people here can raise their hands up and say, at the end of the year, I met all my resolution? Let's see. How many of us can say, I made my resolutions at the start of the year, and at the end of the year, I met everything? I don't see any hands up. But how many of us can definitely say, I made some progress on my resolution? My hand is up. I know I made some progress on my resolution. So by their very nature, targets move us, you know, to ideals we want to achieve. But by their very nature, it's always difficult to meet all your targets. So the Aichi targets for biodiversity, we didn't meet everything. We're still losing biodiversity. But you go to the reports on the Aichi targets, they're all online. It will tell you what we met, what we didn't meet. The SDG targets, the same. It will tell you what we met and what we didn't meet. The climate change targets, the NDCs, there's a lot now on reviewing the NDCs. In fact, the COP in Dubai was a stock take, where we're doing a stock taking of where we are at since the Paris Climate Change Agreement. We meet some, we don't meet some. So for all these international bodies and even regional targets that countries set, it's always a mixed bag. Some we've done okay, some we are on the way, some we're just terrible at some. A lot of the ones that we are terrible on, I can tell you right away, a lot of targets that we are terrible on are targets that meet things like human rights, that respect things like human rights. I can tell you off the top of my neck that generally we are terrible at meeting those, because often those challenge the very political conception of the state, or those challenge state power lots of times and international power lots of times. But we're getting there. Take, for instance, poverty eradication. The world has moved a lot with respect to poverty eradication. Does that mean that there's no more poverty? Of course, there's still a lot of poverty, but there are lots of indicators that we are moving forward with that. Take girls' education. There are indicators of where we are with that. You see, so it's a mixed bag. Some Some biodiversity is well protected, other biodiversities are being terribly exploited. It's a mixed bag. My answer to that is going to be a qualified yes. Qualified yes in the sense that 20, 30 years ago, there were indigenous groups. 20, 30, 40 years ago. Indigenous groups have, or rather, let's put it this way. Indigenous groups have always existed, even when we try to stamp them out. Indigenous groups have always existed. But at onset 1992, you could count the number of indigenous groups that were there. You could count them on your hands. But today, for instance, at the COP or at the CBD, hey, you say indigenous people groups, and there are, on some of these, there are thousands of people, and from almost every part of the world, indigenous people groups are represented. So at the level of recognition and representation, a lot has been achieved. At the level of representation, they are in the room, and recognition that they've got something valuable to contribute, to say. A lot has been achieved. At the level of actually having indigenous knowledge integrated into the scientific processes that then lead to some of these global targets. There's still a lot of work to be done. Because these global targets that we talk about, whether it's the Aichi targets, Paris climate change, desertification, these global targets often they call special scientific meetings. So these targets are debated at the COP, yes. But there are scientific meetings that take place during the year where these targets are debated and agreed on. Often, indigenous representation in these scientific meetings are not yet as strong as they are in the more general meetings. You see, so in terms of recognition, representation, we are way, I mean, there's a lot, and there's still more to be done. So for instance, the current biodiversity framework, the global biodiversity framework, for instance, explicitly says that the implementation of this framework will follow a human rights-based approach, and explicitly recognizes the role of indigenous peoples and indigenous groups. It wasn't so in the Aichi targets. So there is movement in this way. Yeah. Let me respond by saying, in terms of the ecological crisis, the crisis has not gone away. Partly because, you see, we damaged the world so much that the repair is going to be beyond just one generation. So what started in 1992 is still within a generation. The repair is going to take several generations, not just one generation. And right now, we're still at that place where we are still quantifying the extent of damage. And while we are quantifying the extent of damage, damage is still happening. So even when we are putting mitigation and adaptation measures in place, the adaptation measures and mitigation measures are reactive, right? We haven't yet fully gotten to that place where we are actually at that place where we say, do no damage. Take the circular economy, for instance. There's a lot about moving from a linear economy to a circular economy. Linear economy, you produce and throw away. Circular economy, you produce, you use, you recycle, reuse, and all of that. The circular economy is still to fully catch on all over the world. But more and more, we're being more aware and more sensitized towards the circular economy. It's going to take generations. Perhaps 100 years' time, you might come back into the world and see that the world has become fully secular in terms of the production system, production and consumption system, fully secular. But you're not going to achieve it just in our generation alone. There's education, there's conviction, there's values, there's ethics, there's religious belief. All of these things are out there. You see? Now, on the question of why is government getting it wrong? Who defines government getting it wrong? John Maynard Keynes said the state should be the one to do X, Y, Z. And we said, yeah, Keynes, yeah, you know, Keynesian economics and the Keynesian states. And then somewhere along the line, decision makers took to Hayek. So who is wrong, who is right between Keynes and Hayek? Because for Hayek, if you let the states to do what it does, we all become a slave to the state. And you can see some beauty to Hayek's arguments. An extremely powerful state can dominate everybody and make everybody a slave. You can see some beauty to Hayek's argument. You know, so Hayek says because of that, let people do what people do. State, step back and let me do what I'm going to do. You can see some beauty to Hayek. So who is wrong, who is right? Hayek or Keynes? Who is wrong, who is right? So who defines that the state is wrong? You know, so it's not as such a thing about the state is wrong. It's about the people in a state. At the end of the day, you've got to boil it down to people's welfare in every state. People's welfare. So if I live in a so-called democratic state, Nigeria calls itself a democracy. Yeah, Nigeria calls itself a democracy. So if I live in a so-called democratic state, South Africa calls itself a democracy. So if I live in a so-called democratic state, but from year to year, over the next 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, I see that my colleague in China has had an improvement in their welfare, while I have stagnated. Who's wrong, who's right? Is my democratic state getting it right? Or is the Chinese state getting it right? So you've got this thing about the big question about who is wrong, who is right, is such a big question that sometimes you've got to look at the small thing, as in people's well-being and people's welfare. Corporations will tell you that the purpose of business is to make a profit. Can you really make a profit in a situation where people are sickly and dying? Can you really make a profit where people are sickly and dying? Can you? You know, can you? So people's welfare. There will be no world to talk about if there's nobody in it. We talk about the world as people because we are people and we're living, we're alive. But if we do something that everybody perishes, we leave the world to nature, right? Nature without people. So it's such a difficult question to deal with, to say government is getting it wrong. You know, on a general, universal speak, that government is getting it wrong. But when you boil it down to the welfare of people in every state, then the people in every state can say, our government is not getting it right for us, and we need to do something about it. Whether it's people in democratic America, or people in Russia, or people in China, or people in Nigeria, people everywhere, or people in South Africa, I have to say, our government seemingly not getting it right. And we have to do something about this. Why are they not getting it right? It could be corruption. It might not even be that the corporate players in the state are such terrible people. It could simply be corruption. We don't think about that. It could be incompetence. You might find that strange, but it could just be incompetence. You know, so why is it that the government in my state is not getting it right for the welfare of the people? What's going on in my state? And what can we do about it? And then you can create linkages to people elsewhere concerned about welfare in their state. But it might be for a different specific reason, but they're concerned about welfare. So welfare becomes the thing that brings us together. But the reasons why different states may not be getting it right with respect to the people's welfare might differ. So that's how I respond to that. And and like I said, the historicity of the ecological crisis and how it will take more than a generation to get it right, and then the difficulty of making international collaboration work. Those of us who have siblings, 2, 3 siblings in a home, we know what it is like when we're growing up with our siblings. My kids, I got 3 kids, and when we're in the living room and we're watching the television, everybody wants to control the remote control. I want to control it, my daughter wants to control it, my son wants to control it. So that in itself, coordination, coherence, a shared vision, these are things that we've got to deal with. That's what I would say to that. Yeah. That's a great one, Bill. And it's something I've thought about for very long. I've lived in the US now for almost 15 years. And this is the thing, right? Activism works. Even with corporate power, activism works. I'll give you a very recent example. So when the conflict in Israel started, Israel-Palestinian conflict started, and there were voices within the United States, especially within the Democratic Party, that were saying, hey, Biden, we want you to respond this way, we want you to respond that way. Now that the presidential elections are coming on, the election cycle thing that we brought up, when they did the primaries in Michigan and some other states, and Joe Biden won them and won them handily, yes. But there were these protesters that brought up the Palestinian issue, and they felt that even though Joe Biden won, he could have even done much, much better if these protesters on the Palestinian issues were not there. And immediately, I can tell you that Joe Biden's stance with respect to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict changed. I saw it in the news that his stance changed because of activism. But you see, this is the thing about activism. Activists get tired because activists are people. Activists get tired. So an activist can be leading a cause, and that activist gets tired, and that cause begins to sag because activists get tired. But this is then where young people like you and other activists have to come to understand. The environmental challenge is a never-ending battle. There's no end point. There's no point where you say, we've won the victory, because there's no victory. There's actually no victory. There's just improvements, but there's no victory. Because you see, we continue to live with the corporate sector because we need goods and services. And if the watchdog on the corporate sector sags, the corporate sector will cut corners. It's just the nature of profit making. It's the nature of profit making. Anywhere in the world, whoever or whatever is the watchdog over the corporate sector, if they sag, they get sleepy in doing their job, the corporate sector will simply cut corners. So the watchdog function that activism serves must continue. There's no endpoint. There's no victory for the watchdog function in society. So what do activists and activist organizations got to do? Activists and activist organizations have to have a component that is always active to recruit the next generation. You must have an active component that is always there to recruit the next generation, because the next generation are those who are going to wear the cap next when this generation begins to get tired and needs to retire. You need an active generation. So that recruitment side to activism has got to be a continual cycle in order for the watchdog function of activism not to die, because there's no victory. There's no victory. There's none. The battles we are fighting today, our grandchildren will fight in those battles, maybe under different terms, but they will. Our grandchildren will still be fighting the battle of, hey, we got to protect the environment. And believe me, 1,000 years from now, that generation, they will still need people to say, we've got to look after the environment. It's what it is. You know, so we've got to continually do that. There are questions here about the Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement components, accountability, clean development mechanisms, and all of this. Now, the Kyoto Protocol was the agreement before the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So the Paris Climate Change Agreement has superseded the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol is no more in force, because there's now the Paris Climate Change Agreement. That's what the world now follows. Just like the Global Biodiversity Framework supersedes the Aichi targets. So the Aichi targets are no more in play. It's the Global Biodiversity Framework that is in play. So you want to know what the world is headed, you've got to look at these current things. The old things can tell you what we wanted to do and how we failed to meet those things we wanted to do, or how well we met those things we wanted to do. That's what you can learn from them. But you want to know where the world is going, you look at the current protocols. You know, that's where we are at with all of this. The clean development mechanism, we have moved beyond that. It was a limited mechanism where you could buy carbon credits through forestry program. It was a limited thing. We have expanded beyond that. So we have things like RED, reducing emissions from degradation and deforestation, which supersedes CDM. We now have a more structured voluntary carbon market where you can trade pollution and emissions and all that for carbon offsets and all the rest of it. So things have actually moved beyond the CDM and all of that. And if we're not getting to where we want to get to in the Paris Climate Change Agreement, we can't just put the finger on the corporate sector. Obviously, the corporate sector is fighting for its interest. They have a right to. People in the corporate sector are people too. The world belongs to them, just like the world belongs to those in the environmental sector. They are people too. It's one earth, and we all share this earth. So people in the corporate sector have a right to exist. So it's always about the push and pull. It's always about that. The corporate sector want to do what they want to do to provide goods and services. Those who are environmental stewards and those who are environmental defenders will also do what they have to do to ensure that the corporate sector is held to account and there's a watchdog function for the corporate sector. It's always push and pull. Always. You know, let's not think in terms of a victor and a vanquish. Just like I said, there's no victory. There's actually no vanquish in the long run, because as long as, okay, let's put it this way. The environmental sector only becomes vanquished if there's no activism anymore. Yeah, if there's no activism anymore. So it's not so much that the corporate sector have come together and said, okay, now we're no more producing fossil fuel. There's a victory. On its own, the corporate sector will never do that. Why should they do that? Why? Because should they do that? You know? But of course, the activist community, the environmental stewards and environmental defenders, not everybody here would choose to be an environmental steward. Not everybody here would choose to be an environmental defender. Some of us in here will go and work for the corporate sector. But for those who would choose to work as environmental stewards and environmental defenders, know that, you know, you will be vanquished the day activism ends. Then you're vanquished. That's why the Friday for the Future movement, the one by the young lady from Scandinavia, her name skips me now. What's her name again? Friday for the Future. Yeah, Thunberg. Yeah. You know, that's why her thing was wonderful and amazing, because you see this young person who is a teenager who steps up and says, I want to be an activist right now, not when I have my college degree and all that. That's why it's beautiful to see. And we want to see more of that, you know, because that is what refreshes and renews activism. And for the older activists, that's fantastic. Because you know that if you do get tired and retired, hey, look, there's already another generation that is ready to go. They are ready to go right now. You see? So that was just so amazing to see. Yeah.
Dr. Nuesiri, this was a really stimulating conversation. I really enjoyed sort of the background and the context that you provided, which actually spurred a lot of the discussion that took place this evening. So thank you so much for your time and your efforts, and for engaging us. Sometimes it's difficult to find people who are a little bit older to sort of pass down the knowledge and have so much expertise. So thank you so much for joining us this evening.
You're welcome, and you all take care, and hopefully you all become environmental stewards and environmental defenders.